Okay, so when the military look back in events in history, what we normally want to do, of course, is to look at the great success stories, the great victories, the great commanders who succeeded against all the odds. There can be great merit in that, and we can learn a lot from it. But we also need to face up to some brutal facts occasionally. There's a great book called Heroic Failures and the British. It's got chapters on heroes like David Livingstone, General Gordon, Captain Scott, and others. And it highlights the reality that Livingstone died whilst looking for the source of the Nile in the wrong place. Gordon was cut to pieces in Khartoum when he should have organised the evacuation. And Scott arrived at the South Pole a month after Amundsen. And then there was the charge of the Light Brigade, a glorious military exploit which was pretty much disaster from beginning to end. During the 6 years of World War II, the British Army went through 340 generals who had various mixed success around the world. It's easy to forget, particularly if you weren't alive at that time or haven't studied it much. We lost every single land battle between 1939 and November 1942. Anybody know what happened in November 42? Battle of El Alamein, which was the turning point. The Churchill called it the end of the beginning, and the church bells rang all over the country. It was the first victory we had in the war, and it took us over 3 years. It took about 3 years. Apart from that, it was pretty much failure on all fronts. And the generals concerned were an extraordinary bunch of characters. Some failed because of the circumstances that they found themselves in. Things that were beyond their control. Stuff happened, to put it politely. But others wrote the plans that produced their downfall. And most of those that we now remember as being very successful, people like Montgomery and Bill Slim, who I think was the best British general in World War II, went through the fires of failure before reaching the sunny uplands of success. I don't know whether you've heard the story, but a young reporter met Harold Macmillan when he was Prime Minister as he arrived back from a visit abroad, and did an interview with him, and said to Harold Macmillan, what's the most difficult thing about being Prime Minister? Harold Macmillan replied, events, dear boy, events. Stuff happens. And that's the same for all of us. We have to make choices, and those choices can have a major impact on our lives. Sometimes serious choices and serious failure, which is what this session is all about. For the first 30 odd years of my military career, I basically enjoyed success. I was promoted young, I went to Staff College, I got command, did all sorts of stuff. There were a few setbacks along the way, but they were pretty minor in the great scheme of things. But in 2003, serious failure came my way. Came close to my home, and dealing with it wasn't easy. I've touched on it a little bit already, but in 2002, in the run-up to the Iraq War, I was stood up as the logistic component commander for planning for then a potential invasion. It hadn't been yet confirmed. But in early 2003, in January 2003, the then Chief of the General Staff, General Mike Jackson, who I knew well and had worked for quite a lot, rang me up and said, I want you to go to Washington, and join an office of post-war planning that had been set up in Washington under an American general called Jay Garner. Jay was a really interesting character. He was a retired US Army 3-star. He commanded the operations in northern Iraq after the first Gulf War. Under his command, he had the UK's Marine Commandos. And so he was very happy to see a Brit walk through the door, and he made me very welcome. I joined his office. We moved to Kuwait after a period of time, and then we went into Baghdad. You may remember the day the statue came down, or they called the big statue down. That's the day basically we flew into Baghdad. And over several months, I found myself embroiled in a world of high politics and power, but ultimately, what we touched on it in the questions this morning, a world of hubris. People who just lost sight and became driven by their ambitions and their emotions and all sorts of other stuff. And arrogance and closed minds. Senior people like Rumsfeld who would not listen to those who were speaking against the paradigm Rumsfeld and others believed was the only way of dealing with this. Fighting our way into Iraq went well generally speaking, it went very well. But the post-war planning and the execution was a strategic failure. And I came home from Baghdad in the summer of 2003, as I think I said last night, almost literally this weekend, 20 years ago. I was dog-tired, I was frustrated, I was emotionally drained. It was a difficult time. And when I look back, I see senior leaders who were locked into the paradigm, refusing to listen, but also dissenters who pulled back from telling truth into power, telling the hard and brutal facts of what as they understood it and as they saw the situation. Some did and got sacked for their trouble. There was an American four-star general who I knew a little bit, who told Rumsfeld, this is not going to happen like this, we're going to need 300,000 US troops and a lot of other Brits and so on. And Rumsfeld didn't want to hear and sacked him. But in briefing Rumsfeld, myself and Tony Blair, we touched on the Foreign Secretary, Jack Straw, and others, and then appearing in front of the Chilcot inquiry, I had to face the reality that I was a part of that serious failure and deal with it. The question was, how was I going to do that? And there are various options of what happens to us when we go through failure. Judas doesn't get a very good press in the Gospels. Considering that all of the disciples desert Jesus in his hour of need, this may seem to be a bit unfair. But the bottom line is that Judas is the man, the disciple who betrays Jesus to the chief priests and enables his arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane on that fateful night. Judas is no puppet. His choices were his and his alone. But the consequences went far beyond his control. And is so often the case when things begin to unravel in our lives, there's no brake to apply in order to slow things down, to get back control. Although he's seized with remorse, turning the 30 silver coins and declaring that I have sinned, for I have betrayed innocent blood, unlike the other disciples who had all deserted or denied even knowing Jesus, he ends his life in despair. Rather than facing up to the consequences of his actions, he responds to this massive failure of judgment by sloping away and hanging himself. Dying in disgrace, his failure is complete, and history simply remembers him as a traitor. Committing suicide in response to failure is one option open to all of us. Approaching the Israeli camp as he and Joshua came down from receiving the Ten Commandments, you may remember Moses and Joshua go up the mountain and come back down again with the Ten Commandments, Moses finds a golden calf being worshipped, accompanied by effectively an orgy going on in the desert at the bottom of the mountain. Joshua thinks there's actually a battle going on because there's so much noise going on at the time. Confronting Aaron, who's been left in charge, Moses demands to know what the heck's going on here. As Moses' elder brother, it was Aaron who had seen God do incredible things. It was Aaron who'd thrown down the staff, for those of you who may remember the story in the Old Testament, had thrown down the staff to see it become a snake which consumed the snakes that Pharaoh's sorcerers produced. And it was Aaron who held out the staff when the waters of Egypt turned to blood or produced plagues of frogs, and gnats and so on in that period of time when Moses was convincing Pharaoh to let the people go. But in being confronted with his failure, he responds to Moses' question, firstly, by blaming the people. You know these people, Moses. They're a pain in the arse. They don't listen. They didn't listen to me. Then he blames Moses. You disappeared up this mountain. I didn't know where you'd gone. I didn't know how long you were going to be gone, and therefore it's your fault. And then he blames God. And by the way, all I did was throw some gold into the fire, and out came this golden calf. He doesn't talk about the fact that he actually created this thing. What's going on here? Group pressure that he couldn't face up to, embarrassment, a sense of having been number two in the chain of command, which I think is interesting. Along with Miriam, you may remember the story, he and Miriam had once attempted a coup against Moses, only to be strongly reprimanded by God in a serious interview without coffee. Whatever his case, his response to failure was to push back, blame others, and plead innocence, an option that is open to all of us when failure hits. When Pilate first arrived to take up his post as the Roman procurator of most of what is Israel today, in around AD 26, he discovered that there was no statue of the emperor in Jerusalem. And this was the only city in the Roman Empire where the people didn't have to bow down to such a statue in the central square. Deciding to establish his authority early on, which is not a bad leadership principle actually, he makes his first entry into the city with banners flying, banners depicting the emperor and the various Roman gods. He orders the banners to be hung on the walls of the fortress overlooking the temple area before returning to his palace in Caesarea. The Jews are furious at this display of false gods flying over the temple. And to cut a long story short, 7,000 of them stream out of the city and go to stage a sit-in in Caesarea outside his palace. Pilate backs down and he removes the banners. Not long afterwards, he raids the temple treasury to pay for an immense viaduct, which you can still see today, designed to carry water to the city from some ancient reservoirs about 6 miles away. Every Jewish male had to pay a annual temple tax. So you can imagine what they thought about this idea of the temple treasury being raided by Pilate. When plainclothes troops appear in the temple area to secure the money, there's an ensuing riot and there's several thousand casualties. A lurid report is sent to Rome, and Pilate is subsequently severely reprimanded, heavily criticised. So with his career under threat, Pilate moves to Jerusalem for the Passover week and establishes his judgment seat at Praetorium in the heart of Herod's fortress, where early in the morning the Sanhedrin bring Jesus to him. It doesn't take long for Pilate to realise that these charges are a farce. Sloping shoulders, he sends Jesus to Herod, hoping that he's going to resolve the problem. But this fails, and Herod sends Jesus back, having roughed him up a bit first. Clearly confused, maybe even frightened, with his wife warning him that this thing is getting out of hand, Pilate persists in trying to release Jesus under the guise of the Passover amnesty. The high priests then play their trump card. If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar. Outmaneuvered, with his already precarious reputation in Rome now dangerously threatened, Pilate's resistance collapses. Refusing to execute a man who has supposedly set himself up as a rebel against Caesar could prove to be the end of his career. Moving to the judgment seat, he washes his hands of the whole affair, makes one final appeal, signs the death warrant, and hands Jesus over to be crucified. Pilate vacillated, had qualms, showed some compassion in a way. All of that is true. But whilst washing his hands in public of the whole affair may have made him feel better, in the end he ran scared and sacrificed an innocent man in order to save his own career and his own skin. He was a man dominated by ambition and fear, and there are many others around him, many others like him around today. Indeed, the truth is that there's something of him in most, if not all of us. In the face of failure, Pilate chooses self-preservation and career, which is another option open to all of us when failure hits. Finally, we're told in 2 Samuel chapter 11 that in the spring, when armies go out to war, King David stayed behind in Jerusalem while Joab led the army out. Did this failure to take his place at the head of the army in the new campaigning season reflect an idleness or an easing off of his responsibilities, or was it a calculated move to allow him to commit adultery? We don't know. But as Bathsheba bathed on the rooftop, we know that he lusts after her. Sex often sits at the heart of failure. Temptation often grows, little by little, until over time it grabs a hold. David fancies Bathsheba, He sends out messengers to bring her to his palace. He uses her and he sends her home. But then he discovers that she's pregnant. She sends word to him. David's choices are now beginning to produce consequences. Now we know that David is a very brave man. The story of David and Goliath, which I'll touch on tomorrow. But his reaction to this failure is that of a scheming coward. Rather than face up to the consequences, in a cold-hearted scheme, he tries to manipulate Bathsheba's husband, a soldier called Uriah, and get rid of him, basically. Through Joab, David arranges for Uriah to come back to Jerusalem, to what the British Army calls to have some R&R, some rest and relaxation away from the front. He tells Uriah to go home and wash your feet. In other words, have a bit of fun with Bathsheba, an intimate moment. Uriah says, I can't possibly go home to be with my wife when all the boys are at the front, still in the fight, and he sleeps on the floor in the palace. David throws a drinking party, but a drunken Uriah still refuses to go home. So finally, David sends a message to Joab and says, send Uriah to the front of the battle, and when the enemy hit, move everybody else back and allow Uriah to be surrounded and killed on the battlefield. Which happens. Having seemingly got away with it, David then tries to get on with his life. There's no sense of repentance or regret, and Bathsheba moves in, the baby is born. But David is living a lie. They have committed adultery. He has effectively murdered Uriah. There has been deceit and the misuse of power. As we see all around us today, as we touched on earlier in the question time, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Greed and pride probably lie at the heart of it, and pride, as we all know, comes before a fall. And the truth is that, like Pilate, there's something of David in most, if not all of us, hiding from the truth and trying to move on as though nothing had happened is another option of dealing with failure. But then a year or so later, David is confronted by Nathan. Nathan tells him a story, and the truth of what has happened is revealed. But unlike Judas, or Aaron, or Pilate, David now repents. We can discuss and speculate why he does so. Perhaps if everything is going to be revealed in daylight, as Nathan tells him, then maybe David reckons he's got no choice to go come clean and go public. Maybe. Or maybe that's unfair. Maybe it's been eating away at him all of this time. Whatever the reality, from what we read, there is genuine repentance. And David goes on to write some of his best psalms. Of course, the most famous one is Psalm 51, some of you will know. This is my little diary, the Bible I take with me on operations, or I did take around the world with me. And there's a few psalms, like particularly Psalm 27 and one or two others. But Psalm 51 says, have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love. According to your great compassion, blot away my transgression, wash away all my iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is always before me. He then goes on to talk about being cleansed with hyssop. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Hide your face from my sins. Create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me. Through Nathan's bravery and David's own repentance and prayers, he is restored. Restoration is complete, he is renewed, and there's a new chapter in his life. Some of you may remember Chris Robshaw, who was involved in England winning 4 of the 6 Nations rugby championships that he was involved with, and being runner-up in 4 others. But along the way, there were some serious reversals. Like you may remember the 30-3 last day Grand Slam hammering by Wales in 2013. I remember pulling into a pub in Wales to listen to this game, thinking we were going to win the Grand Slam, and leaving at half-time in frustration because we were being thrashed. And then, of course, the subsequent failure of England's World Cup campaign, which ended with them being eliminated in the group stage. It was a salutary experience, and his captaincy became the butt of an awful lot of criticism. Yet he's made of stern stuff, and he's honest about his failings. He didn't duck the issues. He said in an interview, "You can't repress it and pretend it never happened. It was painful, but you can't live too much in the past. You have to be analytical. You have to know so that you can learn from it and move forward." And he added, "You go through tough times, and it's a matter of how you respond. It's about the character of the individuals." In that same interview, the reporter wrote that there was a sense of renewal, he used the word renewal, of Robshaw, and indeed of England. A new chapter, the reporter said, emerged out of a desire to reconstruct something of substance out of the rubble of the World Cup. Words like acknowledgement, a new chapter, character, renewal are pretty well spot on. And they are another option that is open to us when we are faced with faith. So where does that leave all of us? Well, the reality is that what at first looked like outstanding decisions in our own lives can sometimes turn sour for us too. Our careers begin to stall. Where we hope to be in a certain stage in our lives doesn't materialize. Or they become too tedious, or too demanding, or they crash and burn. Our wives begin to lose appeal, or we become less appealing, or somebody else's wife becomes more appealing. We discover that we can't have children, or we can't stop having children, and they become difficult or rebellious. Our dream home becomes financially impossible. Struggling with the pain of life and facing huge challenges, marriages can be tough, children difficult, jobs and bosses too demanding and too depressing. And amidst all of that, in the face of an accumulated toil of disappointment and maybe even betrayal, the harsh reality is we too could make choices that lead to failures of one sort or another. But if that's an unpleasant reality, how we react or respond to those failures isn't. Like the reporter, Joseph Fort Newton, a Baptist minister in the early 20th century, once said this: "We cannot tell what may happen to us in this strange medley of life, but we can decide what happens in us, how we can take it, what we do with it. And that is what really counts in the end. How to take the raw stuff of life and make it a thing of worth and beauty. That is the test of living." Failure can make us, or it can break us. It can uproot us, or it can root us deeper. When it first hits, our first reaction may be to avoid the issue, to blank it out, to hunker down, or try to move on, or run away. We may defend and justify, blame, attack others. But if we're to grow through it, we have to face up to and accept some realities. Realities that life is tough. There's no such thing as an easy or crisis-free life, a life with no hurt or loss or failure. And then face up to the brutal fact that our failure is our failure and nobody else's. At the centre of all of this, I think there's something about the heart. The Bible talks of stiff-necked people, of blind people, of afflicted people, of rebellious people. It talks of the hardened heart of the Egyptian Pharaoh, the cold heart of the people of Israel, and the penetrating heart of Judas. But it also speaks of broken hearts, clean hearts, undivided hearts, and contrite hearts, new hearts. Christianity is built around the worship of a God who was betrayed, crucified, and seemingly defeated. Yet he rose victorious. And the Bible talks about the clay of our lives being reshaped, about the Lord replacing the years that the locusts have eaten away in Isaiah. That from the wreckage can emerge new life, a restored life. There may be scars, That's a reality. But the scars can be very powerful. They are a sign of healing, and they speak of our history, a history that shapes us. God's grace is the glue that heals the scars and makes the scar tissue tougher than it ever was before. We may walk with a limp, but we can nonetheless still walk. David wasn't perfect, indeed far from it, but we're told he was a man after God's own heart, which is an extraordinary thing for the Bible to tell us. This is an adulterer and a murderer and a pretty rotten bloke at certain stages in his life, and yet we're told that he was a man after God's own heart. Moses was a murderer. Paul was a volatile enemy of the church, barely to be trusted. Indeed, in the early days, he wasn't trusted by the church in Jerusalem. Yet these men all pull through, and they go on to achieve great things, and not simply throw in the towel and slip away. Perhaps the greatest example of all of them is Peter. Exposed as a blowhard and a coward, he retreats to what he knows best to nurse his wounds. He goes back to fishing. Come on, boys, let's get back to the lake and go fishing. Then he sees Jesus on the shore of the lake, preparing breakfast, barbecuing fish, serving as usual. The Son of God serving a bunch of failures, with Peter the pride of the bunch. I wonder what Peter felt and thought as he leapt from the boat to go to the shore to meet Jesus. Did he think that Jesus had come to rebuke him? To tell Peter that what he now needed to do in order to be accepted again, you need to do these things? None of that occurred. Jesus simply asked him a series of questions, not raking up the past, but aimed at confirming, exposing Peter's real heart. Peter, do you love me? You know I do, Lord. And feed my sheep. Peter, do you love me? You know I do, Lord. Feed my lambs. Peter, do you love me? Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Then feed my sheep. Care for my sheep. In other words, Peter, the original mission that I had for you still applies. You are not being dumped. You are being restored. There is work to be done, and you are my man to do it. Let me finish with this. Maybe you are living through the consequences of failure in your own life at the moment. And it's tough. Of course it's tough. Maybe you're pretending that everything's okay when you know in your heart that it isn't. The question is, what are you going to do about it? You have a choice. Aaron blamed others and pleaded innocence. Pilate washed his hands of the whole business. And Judas decided to commit suicide. What's your answer to failure in your life? How have you responded? It took me quite a while. I needed to recognize warning signs that indicated things were getting me down, particularly becoming impatient and irritable. Ironically, the people that I love most, my wife and my children. Signs for you may be the same, or you may start eating too much, or not eating at all, or being hyperactive or passive. You may simply want to escape, sail off forever. It may be taking to drink or to drugs, or it may be something even worse. Despite having been awarded the Distinguished Service Order for his leadership in Afghanistan in 2007, and then being selected to carry Prince Philip's coffin at his funeral, somebody I knew reasonably well, Major General Matt Holmes, was removed from his post as the Commandant General of the Royal Marines 20 months into a 3-year stint. In other words, he was moved on early. It happened just as he was in the middle of a divorce from his wife Leah, the mother of their 2 children. Uncertain of what the future held for him, disappointed with the fact that he moved on with his job that he had looked forward to all of his career, Matt decided the only answer was to commit suicide. When we face periods of emptiness in our lives, when we are down, we can be dangerous. Dangerous to ourselves and dangerous to others. I had to know and use what I call streams of replenishment to enable me to move through that difficult time. Refill my bucket of confidence and courage and enable me to re-engage. For me, that was spending time with family and friends, being alone in the hills, just being quiet and spending time reading the Bible and in prayer. For you, that may include those things, but it may include something else. It may be getting out onto or near water, going sailing across the Atlantic, or going somewhere else, or playing sport. What is it that enables you to refill the bucket of your self-confidence, to enable you to move on through failure? The bottom line is you need to know what those things are, and then you need to understand how to put them into practice. Churchill declared that success is not final and failure isn't fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts. And one definition of success is moving from failure to failure with no loss of enthusiasm. David and Peter faced up to reality and were restored. When you look back at the failures in your life, maybe at what you're going through now, how do you respond? How are you going to respond? What are you going to do about it in your life? And I want to come back to the issue of courage as our final slot tomorrow morning. We look at that as an issue. And that's me.
Thank you.